When I was around the age of 16, I met a man who changed the way I see the world around me. His name was Lee W. Hughes, and he was an artist, an impressionist painter who lived not too far from Gill St. just down the road in Gladstone. Lee was a really awesome guy. He was a jolly fellow, kind of had a Santa Claus-like demeanor to him. And the way that Lee painted was that he would take an easel and a canvas and go out into nature and paint what he saw around him. Here's Lee teaching painting, something he also really loved to do. I met Lee through one of his students who was a family friend of mine. And she said, I think you really like this guy. When the weather wasn't so hot and Lee couldn't paint outside, he would go indoors to a studio where he liked to blast really loud classic rock music. Now this was music I was just starting to learn to love in my own life, so Lee and I really hit it off. And he told me that anytime I wanted, I could come down to his studio and hang out with him and watch him paint. Now, Lee was filled with all these little interesting nuggets of information. He might tell you how he fought in the Korean War, or what he had for lunch that day. It was always kind of a toss-up. He also suffered from a few health problems, but he never complained. He had diabetes and what he liked to call his bum hip. In fact, when standing painted him, he would jam a paintbrush into the end of a bamboo stick and he would sit in front of his canvas and paint at arm's length. One time I was hanging out with Lee and he was painting a picture of a snowy street in Gladstone. And it had a lot of whites and grays and some blues in it, colors you might associate with a snowy street. And he looked at me with a funny smile on his face and he said, "Kid, you're in luck. I'm about to put the finishing touches on this painting." And I watched him dip his brush into a deep, almost blood red color, and I thought, okay, he's going to paint like a balloon in the sky or a bird or something. But instead, he touched the brush to 3 consecutive spaces on the canvas. And he told me that he did this in order to create a transition, or to draw my eye across the canvas and tell a story within the picture. That particular painting was lost to time, but here's an example of one that's actually hanging here at Gill St. Now, the train tracks sort of accomplish, I think, what Lee was trying to do. But if you notice, there is some red in the bottom corner, and then the tops of the telephone poles in the distance as well. That transition that he created draws your eye across the canvas. Lee told me that he always puts a little bit of red in all of his paintings. And then he went on to tell me that all artists use these types of transitions in their work. It could be a paintbrush, it could be a saxophone solo, or it could be a movie camera, but all art uses transitions in order to tell a story and affect the viewer or the listener in a particular emotional way. I kind of stood there and looked at him funny. I didn't really understand what he meant. But if you think about it, a transition is neither here nor there, but instead the space in between. Whatever takes you from point A to point B. Because I didn't fully understand Lee at the time, I think I needed to go on my own journey from A to B. I graduated Gill St. in 2003, and I made my way to Los Angeles, where I attended film school at the University of Southern California. I'm responsible for this guy right here. I wrote the screenplay for STUNG. So please take what I'm about to say with a few grains of salt, or the giant mutated killer insects will come and get you all. Now, the most important thing that I started to notice in art around me came initially in paintings, because I think that was the natural progression coming from Lee. This is a painting by George Seurat. Now, Seurat does not use conventional brushstrokes like Lee does. Instead, he paints with little points of light that transition into one another to make familiar shapes or colors to the human eye. Pay attention to the spot just above the black dog on the lawn, because this is a close-up. I think it actually could be a beautiful painting in its own right. It actually could be one of Lee's paintings. But you can see how much attention to detail goes into Seurat's method of creating those transitions. This is a Jackson Pollock. Jackson Pollock, I actually don't think really cares that much where your eye goes on his canvas. In fact, when you stand before a Jackson Pollock, and most of them are the size of whole walls, you're almost overwhelmed by the amount of transitions in front of your face. The first time I saw this painting, I thought to myself, is this the way that Jackson Pollock sees the world, as just one big messy canvas? Now, Lee and I connected on music in many ways, and one time I was hanging out with him and he asked me if I ever wonder why a rock song ends abruptly or sometimes they slowly fade out at the end. And I said, no. And he said, well, it's the transitions. Once I started thinking about music in that way, I noticed that a lot of musical artists will draw you into a song with a really awesome poppy intro, such as this.
'Cause baby, now we got bad blood. You know it used to be mad love. So take a look what you've done. 'Cause baby, now we got bad blood.
Hey! Now I know that when I hear that song, or that intro to that song, I definitely want to listen to the rest of it. Sometimes they'll leave you with a really happy, warm feeling at the end, something that makes you want to, pump your fist in the air like this. Big Bruce fan here. A lot of times, musical artists will use transitions across whole albums in order to affect you emotionally. Let's listen to the end of the A side and the beginning of the B side of Abbey Road by the Beatles. Now for this, I'd like everyone to close their eyes and just listen to the music and ask yourself what you think the Beatles intended to emote from you when they created this transition. Now, at a certain point, the music will drop out, but keep your eyes closed. Right, so it's the end of She's So Heavy that literally ends mid-note, drops out in a very dramatic kind of way. I know when I hear the end of that song, I think to myself, yo, Beatles, I was just listening to that. Give me back my song. Now, if you're listening to this record on vinyl, you'd have to get up, cross the room, turn the record over. But if you're streaming it, still, there's that pause. And then Here Comes the Sun comes on. It kind of leaves you with that happy notion of hope, and you think, okay, I'm ready for the rest of your album. Bring it on. Now, like I said, I'm a filmmaker, and I actually think film is the most powerful example of Lee's transition hypothesis. If you think about movies, they're 24 frames a second, and in between each frame is a little gap, and when strung together, it makes a moving image. But even more importantly than that, film editing uses very powerful transitions in order to affect the audience in an emotional way. My favorite transition of all time is from 2001: A Space Odyssey by Stanley Kubrick from 1968. Now that movie opens with a 20-minute sequence set at the dawn of man. It's a bunch of apes running around, screaming and yelling. They encounter an alien monolith that starts to unlock different parts of their brain. It's a trip. If you haven't seen it, definitely check it out. But at the end of that sequence, one of the apes discovers that it can use a bone as a weapon. And after killing one of its fellow apes with said bone, it sort of screams out triumphantly and throws the bone into the air like this. Now what does Kubrick do? He cuts from the falling bone to space, the future, and match cuts with a spaceship moving through space. What is he trying to say there? Well, aboard one of those spaceships is a supercomputer named HAL 9000 who's about to try and murder his entire crew. So if you think about it, Kubrick is drawing a line between one of the first weapons ever and a future weapon. That's a really powerful transition. I heard there's some Star Wars fans in the audience. Let's take a look at one from Star Wars. Now, George Lucas wrote and directed Star Wars, but his wife at the time, Marcia Lucas, edited the film. And what she does here is cut from a scene at night to a scene at day, what we call a time jump, and she literally uses the shape of a clock to wipe the screen. Might be a little on the nose, as we say, but Marcia Lucas won an Oscar for editing Star Wars in 1977. This last one's fun. It's from 2003's Hulk, directed by Ang Lee, based on the comic book. Now, there's no sound, but notice how Ang Lee uses panels much in the same way that a comic book does in order to literally draw your eye across the screen. There's our big green guy. So much action happening all at once, much like the way you read a comic book. Now, once I unlocked Lee's hypothesis within film, I started to notice it literally everywhere in my life. Let's take literature as an example. Here's a poem by Emily Dickinson. You don't even have to read it, but literature uses punctuation and page layout in order to draw your eye into a certain direction or affect you emotionally. Emily Dickinson, very famous for using hard dashes and big spaces. She was writing about heavy, emotional material. It also exists in fashion. Here's Icelandic singer Björk dressed as a swan. Now, it's a little extreme, I will admit, but ask yourself where your eye is drawn on her swan dress. Who knows why she chose to wear that, but this is the Disney Concert Hall in Los Angeles, designed by architect Frank Gehry. You start to notice now how space and shape transition into the real world. This is my iPhone. Many people consider Steve Jobs to be an artist in his own right. He was famous for not really liking hard edges on any of his products. So he transitions from one side to the next with a nice, soft, curved, rounded feature. It's pleasing to the eye and certainly pleasing to the touch. To date, of course, Apple has sold over 600 million of those iPhones. I never got to tell Lee how much our little conversation in his studio meant. Unfortunately, he passed away in 2014 while he was living in Northern California with his daughter and his grandkids. This is a painting of his that I have hanging in my apartment in Los Angeles. I like it because it reminds me of the East Coast, reminds me of home. We don't really have any transitions between seasons in Southern California. But I also like it for that little splotch of red down in the corner. Albert Einstein spent a great deal of time searching for something that he called the unified field theory of physics, or what others called the theory of everything. It was supposed to be an equation that unlocked the entire universe, put an umbrella over all of the physics that we experience in our lives. Is there such a thing that unites all of the art that we create? Because art is very important to us as a culture. It interrupts our everyday mundane lives and reminds us what it means to be human. We keep it in museums, we protect it, we give awards to those who make it, and sometimes we even say that it's priceless. Why is that? Well, I think Lee would say it's the transitions. Because life is chock full of transitions. You're born, you grow up, you go to school, you graduate, you go to college, maybe you drop out of college. You get your first job, you hate that job, you quit. You get a new job, you love it, you get promoted, you become CEO, you retire. People come in and out of our lives all the time. People pass away. You might find love, you might lose it. Hopefully, you find it again. Sometimes those journeys you go on are difficult. Sometimes you want to run the other direction. Or it's the opposite and it's the best time of your life. It's pure bliss. I know that much like the transition between the A and B side of Abbey Road, when things get heavy, you have to remind yourself that the sun will always come out again. When I see a movie that makes me laugh or cry or scream, when I listen to a song that makes me want to rock out, or see a painting that catches my eye, it gives me great comfort to know that they're all connected in some way. So in his honor, let's call it the Lee W. Hughes Unified Theory of Art. Thanks a lot.